Siwmai a chroeso i gyflwyniad yn y gyfres Lleisiau Cymraeg. Um, Welcome to another presentation in the Welsh Voices series. I'm Robert Humphreys, part-time director of the Great Plains Welsh Heritage Center in Wymore, Nebraska, and I am actually speaking to you today from the Great Plains Welsh Heritage Center in Wymore on a very, very chilly afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Jerry Hunter. He is a professor of Welsh at Bangor University in Wales, and I believe he joins us today from his home. Is it near Penygroes?
Yeah, Pennygroes, Nantlle Valley. Yeah.
Yeah. So he is a very accomplished scholar of Welsh literature, and he's also a novelist, a poet. He has written extensively about the history of Welsh immigrants in North America and their literary culture. And so today he's going to be presenting on the history of Welsh American soldiers in the Civil War in this country. So I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to Jerry to take it away. Jerry.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Mae'n blesur bod yma. Diolch, Robert. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be talking with you. I know that the Great Plains Welsh Heritage Center does so much, for promulgating knowledge about the Welsh culture and history, as does the Madog Center. So we've got representatives from several great Welsh American centers here. So it's a pleasure to talk about this. And I'll be talking about a book I published a couple years ago, Dros Gyfiawnder y Rhyddid in Welsh. So it's nice to be able to talk about it in English with people who might not be able to read Welsh. So I'll go. I've got a slide presentation. I I was a bit lazy. Took some slides from another presentation. I haven't had a chance to translate them all into English, but I'll translate as I go, and I'll go through them, and we can have a discussion. I'll be happy to take questions afterwards. So let me see if I can. Here we go. Get this up. Let's see. There we are. I'll run the slideshow from the beginning and then share my screen, and hopefully this will all work. Let's see. Okay. Is that you seeing the slides now?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, there we are. Okay. That is Bangor University at the bottom. That's not Racine, Wisconsin, in case you're in any doubt. Yeah. So, Cambrian Guards in the Civil War. Okay, so this book, yeah, Dros Gyfiawnder y Rhyddid for Justice and Freedom, Cambrian Guards, Ceithwasiaeth or Revolcatra America, the Cambrian Guards, Slavery, and the American Civil War, something I published a couple years ago. Now, I published several books and also presented a television documentary for S4C years ago, 15, 20 years ago, all about Welsh American writing from the American Civil War. And I hadn't really planned on doing anything more on that subject because I had done a lot already, and there's other things I wanted to do with my research time. But I had years ago when I was writing my general overview sort of studies of Welsh writing for the American Civil War, I noted that there's a nice collection of Welsh language texts from the same group of soldiers who served in the same company in the same regiment. And I sort of put them all in a folder labeled a 22nd Wisconsin. And a few years ago, I was compelled to blow the dust off that folder and get to work, and I ended up writing this book. So it was something I hadn't planned on doing, but I was drawn back to it in a way. So with a picture of a reunion of some of the 22nd Wisconsin. I don't know which ones are here, but it's a nice picture as we're delving back into the history and at the start of the First World War, taken in September 1914. So just I know some of you will know a lot about American Civil War history. Some of you won't be so up with the military history. So just a quick overview. I'm talking about one Company F of the 22nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry, who were dubbed the Cambrian Guards for obvious reasons. A regiment at the start of the war, a Union infantry regiment, had 1,000 soldiers. A company had 100 soldiers, so there were 10 companies in a regiment, plus the field officers in addition to that. Company F, the Cambrian Guards, was raised in Racine, Wisconsin, in August 1862. At least 70 of the 100 soldiers in Company F, the Cambrian Guards, spoke Welsh as their first language. At least 7. I've been very conservative about this. I've not made claims for anyone I can't be sure they were Welsh speakers. So at least 70. So the vast majority of the company spoke Welsh as a first language. Not all of them were Welsh immigrants, and we'll get to that later. This was one of the sort of surprising things that came out of this research, was sort of the socio-linguistic history of Welsh in America. And a lot of these soldiers were American born and raised speaking Welsh in the United States. But in addition to the majority, the vast majority of the serving soldiers in Company F of the 22nd Wisconsin, the captain, Owen Griffiths, and one of its two lieutenants. So a company had three commissioned officers, a captain and two lieutenants. So the captain and one of the two lieutenants were also Welsh-speaking Americans. The majority of the non-commissioned officers, the corporals and sergeants, were Welsh as well. Okay. So just a few snapshots of the roster, the official roster for the company. You can see Owen Griffiths and Robert T. Pugh there at the top, the captain and one of the lieutenants, and some of the other Welsh names as you go through it. And it's not just Welsh surnames that I'm basing my assessment of Welshness on. There's some with surnames like Hall, which you wouldn't think would be Welsh, which were Welsh speaking Americans. So just a quick snapshot of some of the names here. Lots of Davises and so on and so forth, Evans. So a bit about some of the people. We're talking about Owen Griffiths, the captain who was responsible for actually raising the company for the 22nd Wisconsin Infantry. A quick aside, nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but sort of an interesting bit of history. One of Owen Griffith's grandson was General Leslie Groves of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, whose service record included overseeing the construction of the Pentagon and the Manhattan Project. You can see the picture of him there with Oppenheimer talking. So interesting that his grandfather was a Welsh American who volunteered to fight in the Union Army because he wanted to oppose slavery. And that started a big military tradition in his family. One of his great grandsons became a general in the U.S. Army as well. But back to Owen Griffiths himself, a bit of his history. He was born in America, one of the Native American born Welsh soldiers we'll be talking about. His parents immigrated in 1794 to Philadelphia. Then they moved to the Steuben and Remsen area in Oneida County. If you're very familiar with Welsh American history, you'll know that Oneida County, with the city of Utica at its center, and villages like Remsen and Steuben were sort of hot spots for Welsh America. Owen Griffiths was born in Remsen in 1823, which is a very significant year for me. That's the same year that the Reverend Robert Everett from Flintshire and his family moved to Oneida County. Robert Everett became the minister of a series of Congregationalist chapels. He edited the monthly Welsh language journal for Welsh-speaking Congregationalists, a Cynhadwr Americanaidd, and he was really the leading figure in the Welsh American abolition movement. So as Owen Griffith's families were Congregationalists, they came to know Robert Everett very well. And that's, I think, an interesting part because Owen Griffiths himself was an ardent abolitionist. That's his main reason for wanting to enlist and fight in the Union Army, I think. When he was 20 years old, he left home to follow a career in business. First went to Brittenfield, Massachusetts, then to New York City. And this is one of these many examples we have of this Welsh network in operation in the United States. He worked as a clerk for two successful Welsh merchants in New York City, Morris Jones and David Griffiths. He moved to Racine, Wisconsin, and in 1850 took a job with Lee and Dixon, a popular shop in the city of Racine. He was very active in the Welsh Congregationalist Chapel of Racine, and he was elected secretary for the Congregationalist Cymanfa. I'm not sure how to translate Cymanfa into English. It's one of these terms, that's central to nonconformist Welsh chapel culture. It's sort of the association of all of the Welsh-speaking Congregationalist chapels in the state of Wisconsin. So he was elected secretary, I think, which is a testimony to his business acumen and also to his support for the cause of the Congregationalist chapels. He was also very involved in cultural affairs. He was a big supporter of the Cymreigyddion Society, one of these Welsh-speaking literary societies, and the Cymreigyddion put on a lot of eisteddfodau, and he was very active in American eisteddfod uh, culture in the United States as well. More about him in a little bit, but a few of these other characters, Robert T. Pugh, and if you look at the cover of the book, the slide I showed earlier, there's a different picture of Robert T. Pugh. He was very young when he was became second lieutenant of the Cambrian Guards in the summer of 1862. He was 21 years old. There. He was born, like Owen Griffiths, he was born in the United States. His family, his parents emigrated from Llanegrin in Merionethshire, North Wales, to Ohio. And he was actually born on a farm in Ohio. And his mother died when he was a baby, and his father couldn't run the farm and raise a baby by himself. So he was sent to live with relatives in Racine. And then he went, when he became a young man, to work with some other relatives in Canada in business, and then came back to Racine to work as a clerk in business. Interesting enough, one of the other Welsh soldiers from the 22nd Wisconsin who didn't know Robert or Bob Pugh, as they called him well, said that, oh, by the way he spoke Welsh, he was obviously from Merionethshire, but he was actually born in Ohio. It testifies to the extent to which these people spoke Welsh and to the extent to which that defined their identity. Non-Welsh speaking soldiers in different companies in the 22nd Wisconsin infantry referred to Owen Griffiths as a Welshman, and he was born in upstate New York. So interesting, sort of about that aspect. John Bowen, an interesting figure as well. Got promoted up through the ranks, very active and very political, known for giving speeches to his fellow soldiers about radical politics, abolitionist politics, and also very funny, making everyone laugh a lot. Robert Blair Jones, a character we'll talk about. So a few photos to put a few faces out there. These were the company's two musicians early in the war. Each company had two musicians playing the fife and drums, and they also served in the regimental band. So these men could play various instruments. Elias J. Pritchard, there you see, who was originally from Rhiwlas, here in Carnarvonshire, just down the road from me. It's just outside of Bangor, actually, where I work. And John M. James from Aberystwyth originally. Interestingly, most all of these 70 or so Welsh Americans were either from, or their parents were from, Merionethshire or Montgomeryshire. A few from Carnarvonshire, a couple from Anglesey, two from Aberystwyth, one from Llangeitho in the south west of Wales, and one from Flintshire. But most of them are from sort of mid North Wales, mid Wales and North Wales, Montgomeryshire and Merionethshire. But these are the two musicians, and going through the Welsh American press from the 19th century, there's some wonderful tidbits that allow us to put these people's lives together. We find Elias Pritchard and John M. James playing together in Welsh bands in Racine, Wisconsin before the war. They both survived the war. We find them performing together in concerts in Racine after the war as well. So, just a little bit about some of the sources here. There's a lot of sources that were written by veterans from the Cambrian Guards long after the war, usually under the title of things like this: Adgofion Hen Filwr, the memories of an old soldier, right? So you can see Aelod o Gwmni F, a member of Company F, 22nd Wisconsin volunteers. This is John Ellis, who wrote a lot about the war afterwards. He was one of three brothers who served in the Cambrian Guards, Baptists, all from the Llanuwchllyn region in North Wales originally, and Merionethshire again. Uh, his younger brother, Edward Ellis, had just started attending seminary with the intention of becoming a Baptist minister. he left his studies to go with his brother John to enlist in the Cambrian Guards in the summer of 1862. Their the oldest brother stayed home on the farm, but he eventually enlisted too. So by the end, we have these three Baptist brothers serving together. Um, so this is something from one of John Ellis's one of his letters he published years after, and it just gives you a bit of a flavor of the sort of the culture of these Welsh soldiers. Because once these soldiers enlisted, and since there were so many of them serving together, they formed their own sort of Welsh-speaking subculture within the regiment. And I've written a lot about Welsh writing for the American Civil War, and you find this in regiments with smaller numbers of Welsh soldiers. Sometimes when there's only 12 or 20 or 30, they still do this often, bunking together, pitching tents together, holding Welsh language prayer meetings on Sunday, sharing Welsh American publications like a Drych and the denominational journals. But since there was so many in the Cambrian Guards, at least 70, there was a really lively Welsh sort of subculture in this regiment. And these letters by John Ellis give us a really nice taste of that culture. He begins here, "Yr oedd gan lawer ohonom lysenwau." Many of us had nicknames, and one of them, David Evans, was called the Almighty, as you can say. They used the English Almighty, a gelwid Dave. A hynny mae'n debyg am y byddai'n barhaus un a'n deud am weithio gyflawnodd neu y fwriadau wneud. That because he was always talking about things he planned to accomplish, or things he had accomplished, or things he planned to do. So he's always bragging and boasting about doing big things and pretending he could do big things. The nid deg celwydd y byddai and rhyw rafio yn ei ddilli hun. He wouldn't tell lies exactly, but he would sort of rave in his own way. Un arall o fechgyn Company F, another of the boys of Company F was D.H. Davis from Pine River. He said that the company wouldn't have been anything to me without David H. Nid wyf yn cofio iddo golli diwrnod o'i amser yn ystod tair blynedd. I don't remember him missing a day of service during the 3 years. Oedd yn gry a heini, caredig, cymdeithasgar y gwrw. He was strong, healthy, kind, one who did favors for others, and sort of manly or brave again there. And goes on to talk about this. You get a really good, I'm just giving you a little taste of this, but when you read all of the stuff that these soldiers wrote taken together, you get a real sense of how they operated as a community, of the friend groups within that community, which of these soldiers were good friends with each other, and that sort of thing. So really get a chance to sort of know them well. Now this it was really interesting with Roland, one of the other soldiers who later retired and ended up in Emporia, Kansas, actually. Sorry, I'll go back again. So I'm a bit acting up. And Jay Edwards, and he talks about when he was a child in Racine County before the war. In Hiverheni, bydd y dyletswydd deuluoedd yn cael eu chadw nos o bore. So in the house of my parents, family worship was held night and morning and night, we'd say in English. And so this is very common, of course, for religious families. Peth anghyffredin fydd yr teulu ddechrau neu ddiweddu diwrnod heb ddarllen ar ysgrifau ar y gwyddio. So it was very uncommon for the family to start or to finish a day without reading a bit of scripture and praying. So raised in a very religious household. And then he goes on to say, and one of the most earnest sort of beseeches or requests in the prayers of my father, and also my mother in her turn, was to ask the Lord by some way, through some path of his own, to speed the day when the slaves would be free. This is one of the first things I remember from the family prayer. So literally, we find some of these Welsh Americans raised from a very young age to be anti-slavery. And interesting, I mentioned earlier that Owen Griffiths the captain who enlisted the Cambrian Guards, was raised in Remsen, New York, and attended the Congregational Chapel of the Reverend Robert Everett, who was the leading Welsh American abolitionist. One of the things that Robert Everett started saying in his one of his journals in the early 1840s was that we have to raise our children to be aware of the evils of slavery and the privileges of freedom, and we have to have our poets compose anti-slavery hymns and teach our children from the cradle to sing anti-slavery hymns. Literally raise Welsh, and Robert Everett worked to define Welsh America in that way. Said this is what defines us. We're Welsh Americans, therefore we love freedom and we oppose slavery. And we see that, that wasn't just the sort of cultural and religious leaders like Robert Everett. We find this young man saying he was raised from a young age on the farm outside of Racine in Wisconsin to be an abolitionist. That's the main reason why he enlisted. He talks about there was an escaped slave, Joshua Glover, whom the boys called Uncle Joe, he had been a slave in St. Louis, Missouri, and had escaped and settled in Racine, Wisconsin. And he says that we, the lads, or rather near Hokia, we, the Welsh lads, knew him very well. And he always had a kind word to say to us every time. He was a hardworking and honest man, and everyone was very fond of him. And then, because of the Fugitive Slave Act, slave owners could send slave catchers to northern states, to free states, to capture slaves and return them. And this is what happened. Slave catchers came across Joshua Glover, and they took him to Milwaukee to prison until they could send him back to the South. And a bunch of the Welsh men from the Racine community went to Milwaukee, and I think some other abolitionists as well from the area. They broke down the doors of the prison and freed Joshua Glover, who then escaped to Canada. This is well documented in other sources. And he says, and he was a child. He says that he was angry that he was too young to go with them, and he wanted to go with them to assault the jail and free the Joshua Glover, but he wasn't allowed to. But he talks about the impression this had on his mind. Yr oedd y ffaith fod cyfraith ein gwlad yn caniatáu myned ar dyn hwn o'n plith yn ôl I geithwyd yn wrthyn iawn I mi. The fact that the law of our country allowed taking this man from amongst us back to slavery and was despicable to me. So from a very young age, we see this kind of thing. You see another, so it talks here about uh, enlisting, starting with, I won't go through this whole thing, but early on when the war first broke out, wondering whether he should enlist or not. And a friend of the family comes by who, and the parents are talking, the war's here. Where is the president going to get his soldiers? And he points to the young men here and say, well, here are some of them. There's this idea that they should enlist in the army. Now, we will start sticking with the abolitionist theme, which is one of the most interesting things about the history of the 22nd Wisconsin in general. They became known throughout the Army, throughout the United States, and indeed known in the South, in the Confederacy, which became very important, as we'll mention later on, hopefully. They became known as the Abolitionist Regiment because when the 22nd Wisconsin was stationed in Kentucky, they did a lot to help escape slaves to freedom. Now, so they were recruited in the summer of 1862 after Lincoln called for more soldiers when it became obvious that the war was going to continue. The 22nd Wisconsin, including the Cambrian Guards, were trained briefly. Then they were sent down on trains from Wisconsin through Cincinnati, Ohio, where they marched over the river to Kentucky. Now, if you know your history, you'll know that Kentucky, of course, was a slave state, which did not secede from the Union. So technically, Kentucky as a state was still a loyal state in the United States, but it was a slave state. There were several of these states: Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky, and so on. And Kentucky, men from Kentucky, white men from Kentucky fought on both sides, depending on, their political allegiance and usually whether they belong to a slave holding family and so on and so forth. So earlier in the war, Abraham Lincoln and his government were very concerned about Kentucky. They did not want to upset politicians in Kentucky and do anything that would drive Kentucky to leave the Union officially and drive Kentucky completely into the same corral as the Confederate States. So the Union Army was ordered not to take slaves from slave holders in Kentucky, and this was true in other places as well at the time. And this letter we find. Published in the Driac, you can see it in January, 24th of January, 1863, about something that happened earlier and a few months ago. And it's by a writer who calls himself Gomer, which is was a very popular pen name in Wales in the 19th century. A lot of people used the pen name Gomer because there was an apocryphal legend that held that Gomer was the first Welsh speaker. An apocryphal tale appended to the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, where they're building the Tower of Babel up to the heavens, and God wants to frustrate their plans because it's presumptuous that they build a tower that high to reach God in heaven. So God confuses the languages, the idea being that everyone spoke Hebrew before that, and when God confuses the languages, everyone's speaking a different language. That's why people talk about a Babel of voices, a Babel of languages, Babel. And Gomer, according to an apocryphal version of that was very popular in Wales from the late Middle Ages on. Gomer was the guy working on the Tower of Babel who suddenly became a Welsh speaker when God did that. So Gomer was thought of as the first Welsh speaker. So people who were very committed to the Welsh language sometimes used the pen name Gomer. So no surprise there. But we later learned that this Gomer was actually the captain of the Cambrian Guards, one of the companies in 22nd Wisconsin, Owen Griffiths. Why? Well, because there's a letter that survived in manuscript where Owen Griffiths was writing his sister and brother-in-law, and he asks if they received a drych, and he says, if you do, then you'll see a letter by somebody who is very closely related to me. He says, I'll put it this way. This man has the same mother, father, and wife as I do. So he's basically saying, yeah, I'm Gomer. So we have proof that it was actually Owen Griffiths, the captain of the Cambrian Guards, who wrote this letter. So it begins like this: Mr. Galugid, Mr. Editor. There are many people are writing. There's a lot of writing to the Drych, that's the mirror, the Welsh. Sorry, if you don't know about the Drych, which translates as the mirror, it was a weekly Welsh language newspaper published in Utica, New York at this time and read throughout Welsh America. So there's a lot of writing to the Drych from Welsh soldiers from various places. And I thought it would be that a little bit from the 22nd Wisconsin would be acceptable to you, to many of your many readers. Mae rai pethau mewn cysylltiad ar gatrod hon sydd o bwys i'r holl wlad. There are some things in connection with this regiment which are of importance, o bwys, of importance to the whole country. So he's writing this letter because he wants all of the Welsh readers who received the Drych to know what's going on in Kentucky and what his regiment is doing. My Colonel Utley of Racine. This is the colonel of the regiment, William Utley, who was not a Welsh American, but he was a Republican and an abolitionist. So Colonel Utley, the 22nd Wisconsin's commander, is a principled humanitarian. Din garwr egwyddorol. Nid yw ddim gwahaniaeth ganddo pa liw yw y croen. It makes no difference to him what color the skin is, if there is a sign of humanity within. So then he goes on to say, fel y mae'n eglur I bawb sydd wedi ac yn sylwi, fel y mae pethau'n cael eu cerio ymlaen yn y llywodraeth, fod gan Kentucky lawer iawn o ddylanwad o'r dechrau hyn bresennol. So he goes, it's very clear to everyone, as everyone can see and can take note, that the way things are being carried on in the government, that Kentucky has a great amount of influence from the beginning of the war until present. So he basically is arguing that Kentucky, because they're a slave state within the Union, has too much political influence in Washington, D.C. And basically, I won't read the whole thing in detail, but while they were camped in Kentucky, some escaped slaves came into the lines of the 22nd Wisconsin, and they were given shelter. And the owner of some of these slaves was a judge, a very important political figure, a judge in Kentucky who had been a influential politician in Kentucky as well. And he petitioned Colonel Utley to have the slaves returned. Colonel Utley refused. He went over his head to the commanding general of that division of the army. And there were letters back and forth between the general and the colonel, with the general saying, "Look, you know the president's orders. You have to return these slaves to their owner." Colonel Utley refused to do that. And the fascinating thing for us here is that Gomer, that is Captain Owen Griffith, actually got a hold of those letters. He was obviously on very good terms with his colonel. They were both committed abolitionists. And Colonel Utley obviously shared these letters with him. Owen Griffiths translated this correspondence between the colonel and the general to Welsh, and he published it in a Drych. I mean, I don't know what kind of offense that would be in the army today, but he published, secret correspondence between two officers. And Colonel Utley takes the stand saying, he refuses. He said, "This is an immoral order. I'm not going to return the slaves." And he doesn't do it. And so Owen Griffiths wants all of Welsh America to read this and to realize that in their regiment, they're taking a stand against the policy and the orders of the United States government and against the orders of their own commanding general. And he goes on and complains about uh, Kentucky neutral, so-called neutral politicians, that slavery is their alpha and omega, their alpha and omega, their end all and be all at the end. So interesting stuff, very detailed stuff. Interesting now. An, a non-Welsh soldier from another company in the 22nd Wisconsin, Harvey Reid, who wrote a lot of letters home to his family, and these letters have been edited and published. Harvey Reid said this about Kentucky when they were leaving. Now we have bidden goodbye to Kentucky, whose soil has been our home for more than 4 months. I confess with far different feelings towards that state than those I formed after first entering it. The generous hospitality of her citizens, the many instances of noble, disinterested loyalty among the hated class of the North, slaveholders, has proved her undeserving of the slanders of some of our political soldiers and letter writers. And he goes on, and he complains about what he calls the hot-headed abolitionists in his own regiment. And he talks about Owen Griffiths as a hot-headed Welshman. Again, the guy was born in upstate New York, but to Harvey Reid, he was a hot-headed Welshman. Just to show again, and if you know your American history well, you'll know that uh, the anti-slavery stance was not the sort of prevalent stance among Union soldiers. Most soldiers who volunteered to fight in the Union Army said they were doing so to preserve the Union. Uh, a minority were actually abolitionists, and a lot of um, English speaking, German speaking, Irish speaking Union soldiers said they specifically were not fighting to free the slaves. And that's sort of the attitude we have coming across from Harvey Reid here. So again, the abolitionist sentiments, which are so strong among the Welsh-speaking Union soldiers, make them stand out as a group. And I've done a lot of work on a lot of stuff. I've looked at more than 10,000 pages of Welsh language writing for the American Civil War, and it's almost boring to, in a sense, the extent that the anti-slavery, I mean, it's great, it's wonderful and makes us proud to talk about today, but it's very little variety. We don't find the Welsh-speaking Union soldiers arguing amongst themselves about slavery. It's very consistent, and the Cambrian Guards are certainly no exception to that. So some of the other texts written by Cambrian Guards I've talked a bit about, and there were several letters, by the way, which Owen Griffiths published, first under that pen name Gomer, and then he eventually started publishing under his own name, talking especially about Kentucky and what they did to help escape slaves in Kentucky, and complaining about the influence the slave state of Kentucky had over Abraham Lincoln's government, and so on and so forth. But I'll talk a bit about some texts by some other Welsh-speaking soldiers from the Cambrian Guards before I go on. Okay, this is great. I mentioned Elias J. Pritchard before. He was one of those two one of those two musicians. I'll really quickly go back. There we go, so we can see him because he's a great. You see him there, the slide. Elias J. Pritchard from Hewlass in Carnarvonshire. A real character. He was quite a character. And here he is near Danville, writing back to his brother and sister. And this is family who lived in Wisconsin. They're back in Wisconsin. So Anwyl Vrawd a Chwaer, dear brother and sister. And I think that's brother-in-law and sister actually he's writing to. And you can see the actual letter. This is an unpublished letter. So these documents I have, many are published, letters and things published in the Drych and other journals, and there's also some unpublished manuscript letters, and there's several by Elias J. Pritchard. You can see his handwriting there. So, wela fi yn cymeryd y cyfle presennol I anfon ychydig linella atoch. So, here I am taking the present opportunity to send a few lines to you, hoping that they'll find you healthy as they leave me. The kind of formulaic opening talks about receiving their letter, and go on and so on and so forth. And You find this a lot with soldiers, I guess, in many wars, but certainly in the Civil War. They hadn't seen combat yet. They're in Kentucky, and then when they left Kentucky down to Tennessee, and they're saying that they're chomping at the bit to fight. So in the next page, he says, soon we're going to be moving down to Louisville. So they're going from Danville, Kentucky, down to Louisville. Ac oddi yno I lawer afon I rwle y maent yn saethu yn careless iawn. So we're going to go down to Louisville, and from there down the river. They traveled on steamboats along the river, down the river to somewhere where they are shooting very carelessly. And it's interesting. You can see he used the English word careless, and he immigrated when he was a very young child to America. And you certainly find a lot of American English in the Welsh. And fe gaeth a plucky 22nd. You can see the English again in the Welsh. Fe gaeth a plucky 22nd chance I wneud rhywbeth. The plucky 22nd will get a chance to do something. So hoping they'll get a chance to prove themselves in combat. Mae wedi I chadw yn bir dda allan o bob mwster o hyd. It's been kept fairly clearly out of all the sort of fuss until now. So there we go. And we find this another letter he wrote to his later, much later. This is April 1864, after they had the regiment had been captured at a disastrous battle in Tennessee. More about that in a minute. And then they had joined Sherman's march to the sea, and they had started to see combat in Tennessee and Georgia. Um, and You can see him. These letters are in the archive of Emory University, if I remember correctly, by the way. And You can see this other letter. It's very different. He talks about receiving the letters again. He said, newydd ddyfod yn ôl o Chattanooga yn edrych am fy ffrindiau yno. So he said he'd just come back from Chattanooga, Tennessee. So he had some leave, and he went from their camp to Chattanooga to look for his friends there. Looking for specifically Captain J.R. Davis. This is another Welsh musician from Racine that was serving a different regiment, and he went to visit him. And so you see this Welsh social network extending out of regiments, and especially these Welsh musicians from Wisconsin who stayed in touch during the war. I went to see, and he talks about visiting him. You can see the English there. Mae ganddo le first rate quarters, etc. He's got first rate place and quarters and everything very good. He was a captain of a artillery battalion, R.J. Davis. So he's there with this fort in Chattanooga. By then, Captain Owen Griffiths had resigned. There had been a lot of political problems in the regiment, and commission officers could resign their commission and go home, and he did that. So he talks about him going home, and so you have this promotion on up through the ranks, and he talks about Rob Blair Jones, one of the Welsh sergeants from the beginning, being promoted to second lieutenant. You can see there, hefyd fod Rob Jones wedi cael commission in second lieutenant in ein company. So also Rob Jones was commissioned second lieutenant. And listen to this next part. Pan nad oedd ganddo ddim mwy o hawl y swydd nac sydd gen i fi. When he did not have any more right to the job than I had. Yeah. And so he's complaining. So, we've talked about the Welshmen and the Cambrian Guards who were friends. Here we find some tensions and some sniping and backbiting amongst the Welsh in the company. But he had my ganddo ef, and look at the English in the original Welsh, my ganddo ef, influential Christian friends in English and underlined. Na, mi geraf beth, mi gymeraf beth o hynny yn all. No, I'll take a bit of that back. Honey, you a Christian. So he says he's got influential Christian friends back in Racine. That's why he was made second lieutenant. No, I'll take part of that back, the Christian part. He has influential wire pullers, like the Honorable W. Vaughan, who was his uncle. Rob Blair Jones worked for his uncle, who owned a business before the war. His uncle was very big in the Welsh Calvinistic Methodist chapel, and well connected. So he talks about the political connections through the chapel of his uncle being the reason why Rob Blair Jones got promoted to second lieutenant. And people becoming commissioned officers was often political. So you do find this in the unpublished document. You find this very human look at the sort of the tensions within the Welsh subculture within the regiment. Something quite funny about that. And he goes on to say that his friend Thomas J. Davis deserved the job, as everyone knows, and Thomas J. Davis would soon be promoted to lieutenant as well. So we find all these kinds of things. Um, that he was just complaining about Rob Blair Jones being promoted. Well, here we find a letter published in the Cyfeillwr Hen Lad, the friend from the old country. That was the Welsh-speaking Calvinistic Methodists monthly journal. So at this time, there were three denominational Welsh language monthly journals. In addition to the weekly newspaper Adrych, the Congregationalists, the Calvinistic Methodists and the Baptists each had a Welsh language monthly journal published in the US. So this is published in the Methodist Welsh language journal. And it's correspondence that Rob Blair Jones had been sending on behalf of the Welsh Methodists and the Cambrian Guards back to their Methodist chapel in Racine, Wisconsin. And then William Hughes, one of the blaenoriaid or deacons, I guess you'd say in English, of that chapel, forwarded the letter on. So we find this subset of the Welsh speaking chapel culture from civilian life being carried on in the army, and they're corresponding back and forth at the chapel back in Racine. And that's very common as far as Welsh American service history. But of course, it's because of his connections with the chapel that Elias Cyprus thought he got promoted to second lieutenant. Now, this is, I mentioned the three Ellis brothers in the Cambrian Guards, the Baptists from Llanuwchllyn and Merionethshire. This is Edward Ellis, the youngest of the three brothers, who had been training in seminary to become a Baptist minister, who left to enlist with his brother. Here he is writing a letter to a Seren Orllewinol. It's a lovely name. It translates as the Western Star. A Seren Orllewinol, the Western Star. That was the monthly Welsh language journal of Welsh American Baptists. And he writes this letter in this is long, beautiful prose. You can see that this is a minister in the making. He was already well known as a lay preacher. He'd been preaching in Baptist chapels in Racine since he was a teenager. And he's very good with language. And you can see, and he writes here, talking about comparing the soldier's life to the Christian's life. And so it's this extended sort of metaphor about being a soldier, which is like being a Christian, where you have to, wear your weapons and fight against the evil powers and these sorts of things. Like he said at the end, felly mae i'r Christian I elynion a'i gastell ysbrydol. Thus, the Christian has his enemies and his spiritual castle. So you find this, this kind of religious correspondence as well, providing insight into the spiritual lives of these soldiers while they are in the army. These are a few things. David Davis, one of the soldiers who became well, most of the regiment were captured outside of Brentwood, Tennessee. They're guarding a bridge, and most of the 22nd Wisconsin had been in a disastrous battle against a much larger force of Confederate cavalry, commanded by Nathan Bedford Forrest. So if you are familiar with the details of Civil War history, he was a very successful Confederate cavalry general. Forrest. He was also a nasty piece of work. He was a slave owner and made a lot of money in slave auctions. after the Civil War, he was one of the men who founded the Ku Klux Klan for us. So he was, very much committed to his racist ideology. And after they captured most of the 22nd Wisconsin force, really wanted to capture the rest of the regiment, and that included Company F, the Cambrian Guards, the Welsh company, and a few bits of other companies had been left behind to guard a railway bridge. So Forrest encircled them and captured them. And so all of the Cambrian Guards, like all of the 22nd Wisconsin, were prisoners of war for a while, traveled to the Deep South, treated horribly. We've got these detailed letters about their mistreatment, not given much food, marched through rivers, and made to sleep in filthy conditions, and several of them died because of the conditions of their imprisonment. They were later paroled during that part of the war. They would still parole and have prisoner exchanges, so they were then paroled, returned to action later on. But we have letters describing their imprisonment in great detail as well. Now this one, and I'll finish this, and then I'll go on and talk more freely without these props of mine. This is the letter which gives me the title of my book, Dros Gyfiawnder Rhyddid for Justice and Freedom. This is Thomas J. Davis, who ends up being promoted through the ranks in the regiment. He is writing to his uncle, the Anwyl Ewythr, my dear uncle, when he was encamped in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And he talks about receiving his uncle and how glad he was to hear that the family is well. And then he goes on to say, Nid efrhaes erioed ddyfar allan I wneud fy ngorau dros fy ngwlad. I never regretted coming out to do my best for the country. And he goes on to say that he's changed his opinion a little bit about the cause of the war. He says earlier he thought the war had been caused by the hot-headedness, pen boister, and the zeal of the Southern politicians. You can see the English word politicians in there, because they were refused by those who are standing up for the slavery. And now he says he's changed his opinion a little bit about the cause of the war. And at first I thought, okay, so he's not anti-slavery and he thinks the war is for something else. But actually, it's the other direction in which he's moved morally. He now goes on and he says in this wonderful sense, and this guy is another one of the Welsh Americans who was born in the United States, and he writes the most beautiful Welsh prose. So this sentence, Ond bellach amlwg iawn ydyw, mae chwyldrowad anocheladwy ydyw, ymdrechfa an wrthwynebol rhwng cyfiawnder ac anghyfiawnder. So now it's obvious that it is a unavoidable revolution. An unavoidable revolution is the struggle which you cannot resist between justice and injustice. So he says that there's this age-old justice between age-old struggle between justice and injustice, and now we have a revolution against it in the United States. And he says it's not in the nature of things for freedom and slavery to stay together, as Abraham Lincoln said in his famous House Divided speech, any more than Dulverathan, any more than fire and water can stay together, he says. Slavery and freedom can't. So he goes on. And he says, gwell na fechi cymaint a hynny yn erbyn dynoliaeth. Better than sinning so much as that against humanity. And by sinning, he means to allow slavery to continue in the United States. Sefyll dros gyfiawnder y rhyddid. He says he will stand for justice and peace. Coller llawer o waed gwerthfawr y ffordd mwyaf anrhydeddus. Although much valuable blood will be lost in the most honorable way. And then he ends like this. Gwell fydd ei genydd i'r rhyfel bara 2 flynedd eto os rhaid nag yr undeb gael ei hail sefydlu ar gael lleia o gaethwed o fewn i'w chyfansoddiad. So I would prefer that this war continues for 3 more years. This is 1864, so the war had gone on for 3 years. I would prefer that the war continues for 3 more years, if need be, rather than the Union were to be reestablished with the smallest word of slavery in its constitution. So, in very elevated philosophical terms, in a way, he writes about slavery. Now, there's a lot of other things here. I talk about, if you're very interested in military history, Their biggest battle was probably Peachtree Creek during Sherman's march through Georgia. The Cambrian Guards were sent out in a skirmish line ahead of the main soldiers, and they were first to encounter the Confederate forces there. Excuse me. The very interesting John Ellis, whom we heard from earlier. He talks in several of his pieces about one of his fellow soldiers named Owen Owens, who was a sailor from Anglesey. Of course, Racine, Wisconsin is on Lake Michigan. And a lot of the Welsh immigrants to Racine were sailors and worked on ships. Owen Owens from Anglesey was one of these sailors. And often these Welshmen define themselves according to their religion as well as their language and their, heritage and so on and so forth, whether they're Baptists or Methodists or Wesleyan Methodists or Congregationalists. And early on, they say about Owen Owens, the sailor. He's a big, so you can imagine, this big, strong sailor from Anglesey. He said he was not a religious man, and he was a bit of a rough man. He was a bit rough-spoken. I imagine he drank and swore a lot and that kind of thing. And he didn't go to religious service. But during the Battle of Peachtree Creek, when the 22nd Wisconsin was sent in a skirmish line up this steep slope, and they got to the top of the slope, and there's a field of about half a mile of field. And at the edge of the field, there's this wooden split rail fence and an old drainage ditch with some small shrubs growing in it. And they're there spread out, and there's 7,000 Confederates on the other side of the field, hiding in the woods, who then start approaching them. And there was a few companies, parts of other companies as well. So you had about 150 Union soldiers in this skirmish line facing thousands of Confederates, and they held their ground. And at one point, John Ellis records that this big sailor from Anglesey, Owen Owens, when John Ellis says, "Oh, maybe we should, give up," and he said in Welsh, "No, no, once to Libby Prison, they had been held prisoners in Libby Prison in in the South where they were treated very badly. He says, once to Libby prison, never again. So he says, we're going to fight and die. I'm not going to be taken prisoner again. And they held his ground. And that seems to have been one of the turning points of the battle. They actually held the line until the reinforcements came up the hill and helped turn the Confederates. So there's a lot of things like that. Actually, John Ellis himself, even though his younger brother was going to be on his way to be a Baptist minister, he says that it was actually when he first came under fire in that battle when they were taken prisoner early on in Tennessee is when he became religious and had his religious conversion. There's a lot of stuff like that. But again, there's one of the interesting things about this is that I initially wanted to work out the history of this Welsh speaking subculture within the regiment because there were so many sources. It was able to do that. But one of the things that I didn't realize was the amount of these men who were actually born in the United States and raised speaking Welsh to an extent that even some Welsh immigrants thought they were from Wales because of their accent and how they spoke. The extent that, English speaking Americans thought that they were Welshmen. I said Harvey Reid said Owen Griffiths was a hot-headed Welshman. He was born in upstate New York. So interesting, sort of the way in which their identity was sort of broadcast beyond their own community to other members of the regiment and so on and so forth. So there's lots of stuff I could go on about, lots of interesting stuff. But I'll open up the questions. I'm happy to take any questions or comments and see if I can help you if there's anything specifically you'd like to know more about.
Thank you. Diolch yn fawr, Jerry.
Right.
As he said, please feel free to, if we have time for a few questions, and if you'd like to put them in the chat or just speak up, you're welcome to do so. I did while Jerry was speaking, I did mute a few people that were unmuted. So you may have to ask. I may need to ask you to unmute, but please feel free to speak up if you would like.
He says, "Oh, crap. Thank you. Diolch, Rhys."
Jerry, will you
Yeah.
name the Baptist journal that you?
Yeah.
I
Yeah. A Seren Orllewinol, which translates as the Western Star.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that one, but I am the other
Yeah.
two.
It was one of the few Welsh American periodicals that was not published in Utica, New York. It was published in Pennsylvania. And it didn't last as long. It started publication in 1844, and it lasted till the late 1860s. And then Welsh-speaking American Baptists came up with another journal, and so on and so forth. But the Calvinistic Methodist Cyfaill yr Hen Wlad, the Friend of the Old Country, began publication in 1838 and lasted until 1933. Robert Everett's journal, Cynhadlwyr Americanaidd, the American Messenger for the Congregationalists, started in 1840 and lasted until 1902, I think. So, yeah.
There's a comment here from Dan Holiday, says, I live in Milwaukee now and didn't know there was a prison here for essentially deporting escaped people back to the South. What an amazing story of resistance too. He also asked about your book, being the availability of your book. But as someone who lives in Wisconsin, I know that, something about that history of Mr. Joshua Glover and his
Yeah.
and the attempt to release him from imprisonment. Could you speak a little bit more about that environment in the years leading up to the Civil War and
Mm.
the fugitive slave law and its impact on the Welsh?
Yeah. Well, definitely, definitely. Again, we find the evidence is that when I'm talking about Welsh Americans, I don't want to offend anybody, but I'm talking about people who spoke Welsh because in those days the language was really the defining thing for Welsh identity. Really, because all of the immigrants who came to America and the sort of that period would have spoken Welsh as a first language. Most of them probably couldn't speak English. Probably 70% couldn't speak English when they immigrated. So the language was what defined Welshness in that period. And Evidence suggests that Welsh Americans, by 1830 or so, thought slavery was bad and evil on the whole, but, weren't that engaged in doing much about it. But then we find, really with Robert Everett, when he becomes minister of two Welsh chapels in upstate New York outside of Utica, and the Steuben and Remsbury, 1840, really starts on a really coherent, concerted campaign to radicalize Welsh America and enlist them in the anti-slavery cause. And, say you got to do something about it. He's doing this through the printing press. He not only edits the Congregationalist Monthly Journal we mentioned, but for a year in 1843, he has this other journal called a Dingarwr, the Humanitarian, which is just devoted to two issues: temperance. He embraced a lot of radical issues: temperance, women's rights, on anti-slavery. But temperance and anti-slavery are the two issues in the Dingarwr. Mostly of it's anti-slavery. It only lasted for 1 year, but he published it at his own expense and sent it for free to every Welsh-speaking minister in the United States, which was about at least 300 at that point, and to anyone else. So he provided, after a year, a volume of really organized anti-slavery material. He also used the political party. He was criticized Robert Everett for preaching politics from the pulpit. He said, that it's a Christian duty to oppose slavery as well. He supported all the anti-slavery parties, the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and then when the Whigs broke up because of internal arguments about slavery, and the anti-slavery Whigs joined with those earlier radicals from the Liberty Party and Free Soil Party. Then, of course, Robert Everett supported the Republicans as an anti-slavery party in 1856. And we find all of the Welsh American journals doing that at that point, early on, except for there's one thing called Agoron Democrataidd, the Democratic Hero, which is published very briefly, just one issue, I think, published some really a pamphlet masquerading as a newspaper, published before the election in 1856, urging Welsh-speaking Americans to vote Democrat. But there's nothing pro-slavery in that even. It's anti-Republican, it's pro-Democrat, but it's not pro-slavery. So we find by 1856, Welsh America, of course, there's always exceptions to every rule, but generally solidified in the Republican camp politically, mostly because they see it as an anti-slavery party. And then we find with the fugitive slave law, which again, said that slaves were property, and that even in free states in the North, the authorities had a duty to return
Yes.
slaves, to their masters, and so that intensified abolitionist feeling that the war is coming to us. Also, bleeding Kansas. I mean, you're just over the border from Kansas, there, aren't you? At the center there in the Great Plains Center. Um, there's a lot of correspondence that Robert Everett again published in his journal. One of his sons went out as a free soil settler to Kansas, and they were pacifists. I said, a lot of these Welsh American ministers, they embraced a lot of radical politics, anti-slavery, women's rights to a certain extent in some cases, temperance, which, when I talk about that with my undergraduate students at Bangor University, they're temperance, so that's boring. Not, not drinking any alcohol at all. What do you mean? I said, well, it was a radical movement, for social justice because in poor families, when men drank too much, they spent family money on drink rather than food. It contributed to domestic violence, and so temperance is one of these things. And also pacifism. And when I say pacifism, I mean being a committed pacifist. I mean, everyone thinks war is bad unless you're a psychopath or Vladimir Putin or somebody like that, right? But most people, but pacifist people like the Quaker peace testament who think that you should always oppose war, always, no matter what happens. And when Robert Everett's son is in Kansas during the Bleeding Kansas years, when pro-slavery people are agitating, of course, we have pro-freedom people like John Brown and his sons doing it too, becomes a guerrilla war. And he writes back to his father and says, look, things are bad. They're attacking us. They're raping women. They're murdering men. They're burning houses down. And his father writes back and says, do what your neighbors, the Quakers, do, nonviolence still. And he can't do this. But even though we have this debate about this, Robert Everett published his son's letters in Welsh in his journal. So he was like, there's this sort of idea that, okay, we've got these two stances, pacifism and anti-slavery. And in Kansas, you can't maintain them both now. So this is a very complicated moral and philosophical issue that we have to think through. And he published all this stuff. So we find sort of Welsh Americans in some ways thinking through these issues. They also, with the fugitive slave, coming back to that, on the same period, all these things meshing together, becoming increasingly frustrated with the president they voted for after 1860, Abraham Lincoln. When the war starts, we find a lot of these Welsh American religious and moral leaders complaining that Dewi Emlyn from Ohio, a great minister, a Welsh Baptist minister in Parisville, Ohio, writes these big pieces into the Welsh American press complaining that Lincoln, even though he votes for Lincoln, he's Republican, he's anti, but that Lincoln is not, from the war starts in 1861, that Lincoln doesn't link the war to abolition. It's a war to preserve the Union at first, not to free the slaves. And a lot of Welsh Americans are very angry about that. So they're much farther out than the mainstream of the press, which of course is the exact stance we find with the 22nd Wisconsin and the Cambrian Guards in Kentucky saying we're fighting to free the slaves. Our government says we shouldn't be freeing the slaves. Our commanding general says we shouldn't, but that's what we're fighting for. And that's what we're going to do. So that very much comes out of what you see in Welsh America in the sort of 20 years before that, definitely.
There was a question about the letters being preserved in Emory University.
Yeah,
Is there a
yeah.
story that you know behind that?
I don't know how they acquired it. The letters, private letters, we find in various different places. I mentioned one by Owen Griffiths to his sister and brother-in-law. That's, I think, in the one of the U.S. Army War College Museum or something, donated there by like his grandson and great grandson were generals of the U.S. Army. So those papers are there. But I don't know how Emory College acquired those letters. There are copies, photostat copies in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth, which is how I first came across them. When I was doing my first research on Welsh American writing for the Civil War 20, 25 years ago, more, I published a lot of stuff in various newspapers and forums in this country and in the United States, asking if people had any Welsh language letters or journals in the family from the Civil War period. And I got a lot of private things at that time too, as well. So a lot of things in private collections, including diaries. I think I ended up with about 6 Welsh language diaries from serving Union soldiers. But those letters by Elias J. Pritchard, yeah, at Emory University. I don't know how they acquired it. It could have been a donation or they bought it at auction. That's the usual
Okay.
two routes.
Um, the question from Sarah about how many Welsh were estimated to be in America at the time and how many fought in the Civil War.
Yeah,
And
good question.
that's a good question, and I think it's my
Yes.
impression is that we don't know for sure because of the ambiguity in censuses.
Yes.
Um, Looking, from my own experience working with, the research in Wisconsin, I mean, they did in fact note when people were born in Wales. And
Mm.
we're talking of just a couple of thousand, I think, at the most in Wisconsin, for example.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's a good question. I mean, so how many Welsh were in America? I mean, so the 1860 U.S. Census tells us that there's over 45,000 and a couple hundred people born in Wales living in the United States, Welsh born. So over 45,000 in 1860, right? Now that certainly didn't include everybody. Certainly Monmouth was sometimes included differently. But that's Welsh-born immigrants, as we've seen tonight, or today for you over there in your time zones. It's dark here. Um, but many people born in the United States were raised speaking Welsh, and I mean, I know some were, they with the Madog Center in southeastern Ohio. There were some families where the Welsh language survived for 3 or 4 generations. In some cases, I found out when I was first doing research around there. So, 45,000 Welsh immigrants. People had big families. Not everyone raised their children speaking Welsh. Some assimilated, but a lot of them did, sometimes for several generations. So you have to estimate how many Welsh-speaking Americans there would have been by the Civil War. It must have been at least 100,000, maybe a lot more. As far as Welsh-speaking soldiers in the Union Army, again, yeah, it's hard to know. To a certain extent, you need somebody. I'm really a scholar of Welsh literature. I'm a language and literature person. We need one of those historians who really likes to do that, back-breaking archival work to go through all of the enlistment rolls and pairing that with all the census data and work that out. But anecdotally, we've got at least 70 in this regiment. One of the infantry regiments from southeastern Ohio, I think it's the 56th Ohio, had a company and a half. That's 150, groups we can identify. So, just I've probably got an exact record of several thousand that I've, noted
hmm.
myself from written Welsh sources, but that's just the kind of things that come across us. So it's probably many, many more. But one of the things we do find as far as how this ties into Welsh American identity, fairly early in the war, in that Baptist journal that Gene was asking about, a set in Orllewin of the Western Star, published in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Somebody that writes in saying that he was recently in one of the camps, Camp Curtin, where Union recruits were being trained. And he says, I heard Welsh being spoken all over the camp in different parts. And the editor goes on this big rant after that saying, yes, and it's a shame that we can't make an exact count of the Welsh in the Union Army. And so if they could make an exact count in the 1860s, it's hard for us to do now. And he goes on to complain that, of course, you did not have Welsh regiments and brigades like you had, the Irish Brigade, which was 5 regiments, right? You had all these German regiments like the 9th Ohio Infantry from Cincinnati and all these things. So you had, German and Irish brigades and regiments, but you didn't have a Welsh regiment. And there's actually a lot of complaining about that because they wanted a record to be made so that all loyal Americans could say, "Oh yeah, we've got a Welsh regiment, we've got a Welsh brigade. We know that X amount of Welsh men have volunteered to fight." Yeah.
There's a comment here from Dawn Jones, and I think after this we'll kind of start wrapping up the questions. But do you know about Welsh American miners digging the tunnels under Confederate
Yeah.
lines at
Yes.
Petersburg, Virginia?
Yes, and I think Bob Rosser's who I first heard that story from. He did a lot of research on that. Bob did, and yeah, it's quite a story. Yeah, thank you very much.
I seem to remember, and I think when I was a couple of years ago, I went to Savannah, Georgia, and I did a little bit of research on anything I could find about Welsh people in relation to Savannah, and I came across an article which I think you also mentioned, you also quote in your book about this is towards the end of the war, and they're in Savannah, and I think wasn't it? I seem to remember a story about a big explosion, and they looked down and they found that the one that comrade was in this crater, but he was unharmed, or
Yeah. It's a
do I remember
complicated.
that correctly?
Yeah, something like this. Complicated story. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We find it. The march through Georgia. I mean, those three Baptist brother Ellis, Edward Ellis, the one who's on his way to becoming a minister. By the way, they all survived the war. After the war, Edward Ellis does become a Baptist minister, a very influential one, in American Baptist uh, um, culture, in the English-speaking Baptist, not just the Welsh ones. Well, but his brother says that when they're marching through Georgia, they're scrounging for food, and they come across this woman in a cabin who says she's the widow of a Methodist minister, and they want food from her, and she says she doesn't have any. And Edward Ellis takes the ramrod out of his musket and sticks it in this barrel of ash on her front porch, and find that she's got a big ham hidden in there. So they steal it. So, and she says, "You're not going to take food from a poor old widow woman," but they did. And I mean, she was a Methodist, he was a Baptist, so maybe that helps for him on. I don't know, but you find all kinds of things, including some things that are a bit, shocking, and the stories. But there's another story that another soldier told about that same guy, Edward Ellis, when paroled prisoners are coming up on the train past where they're camped in Tennessee. And he says he wants to make some money, so he gets a bunch of apples and he goes sell them to the paroled prisoners on the train. But he said his heart was too tender, so he ended up giving the apples for free to the paroled prisoners. But he didn't treat the Confederate Methodists' widow like that.
Sandy Jones Stanishek asks about documentation about Underground Railroad places or farms in Wisconsin, and I didn't know if that's something you came across, the Underground Railroad, in your research.
Well, I don't know. And of course, the difficulty about the Underground Railroad is that it was secret, right? Because, it was illegal helping escaped slaves to escape. So often you don't find this. But it must have been, once Joshua Glover was broken out of the jail in Milwaukee, it must have been that Underground Railroad network that got him to Canada, right? So I don't know beyond that. I know that Robert Everett's family were certainly stationed on the Underground Railroad, just and from sort of triangulating evidence there's one thing he publishes in the early 1840s where he has an escaped slave speak in one of his Welsh chapels in upstate New York, and I think he had an escaped slave there because he was staying at his house, right? So things like that you find once in a while, but normally, not much direct evidence.
Yeah, I have heard when again, when looking at the Welsh in southwestern Wisconsin, one settlement in a place called Pecatonica, and which, for those in Wisconsin, that's not some of you. I think Sandy Jones knows exactly where I'm. Stanishek knows exactly what I'm talking about, but it's not far from Mineral Point, southwest Wisconsin. I do recall coming across just a line in somebody's local history saying there was a safe house on the Underground Railroad in this Welsh community, but that is really all we have. So, so as you said, yeah, it's kind of secret, but I think that I think there is some research out there that we can find. How much of it is related to Welsh people, I don't know.
Speaking of secret networks, one story which doesn't reflect so well in their service, that there's you always had high desertion rates during the Civil War, and 1.3 of the Welsh soldiers desert from the 22nd Wisconsin, and presumably go back up and are hidden by friends and relatives back in Wisconsin. And Owen Griffiths publishes something in the Drych about that, saying, "I want information where these guys are hiding." And then he rants and says, and they should get the penalty that deserters have, which is death, right? So so you have that as well. And then he suspects that these were actually recent immigrants, and they actually probably absconded back to Wales, actually, so he suspects. So you find that as well. And there was another secret network doing that as well, of course.
Yeah. Well, I'll wrap this up with just Sandy just added that she knew of one a home in Pickett, Wisconsin, which is also that there's a large Welsh community there. There was a stop there, so we have some documentation there. So I'm just going to wrap things up here, and yeah, that's my son saying he enjoyed the talk. So we've had a really fascinating discussion here with Dr. Jerry Hunter, and I just want to say I really appreciate the fact that you are bringing this material to light for people who do not read Welsh, and that's definitely something that's needed in this country, in the United States, for people to understand the contribution and the actions of Welsh people during this time. But if somebody and also you're making this visible to people in Cymru as well. Um, if somebody wants in English, somebody who only reads English wants to
Yeah.
read about this material. I mean,
Um,
I know you wrote "Sons
yeah,
of Arthur, Children of
that's
Lincoln."
right. I do
Is
have
that what
that.
we will recommend to
Yeah,
as
so
yeah?
so my book, Sons of Arthur, Children of Lincoln, Welsh Writing from the American Civil War, University of Wales Press. That is a detailed, but an overview, but a very detailed overview of the Welsh language sources from the American Civil War. And a little bit about the 22nd Wisconsin and Kentucky is mentioned there. I'm sure there's a bit about that there actually. So, but yeah, that's the big English language book I have. That one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Diolch yn fawr, Jerry. Um,
So,
I have a couple of just a couple of announcements. This will be on YouTube once I get it put up there, and I will try to edit out our little technical difficulty there. So, thank you for bearing with us, Jerry, and
sure.
everybody who joined today as we tried to make things work. And we've had a change in the schedule for the Welsh Voices series. It was going to be Dr. Bill Jones next month, speaking on the Royal Welsh Ladies Choir. Unfortunately, he is unable to make it next month. We will be rescheduling his talk later in the year, or possibly early next year. But instead, we have a presentation from Cymru, from Wales, Afonydd, Poems for Welsh Rivers, Cerddi Afonydd Cymru. And we will have several poets discussing and sharing some of their work. It's an anthology of poems about the rivers of Wales. The poets include Maya Evans, Claire E. Potter, Catherine Murray, Adele Evershed, and Meg Ellis. And
Mm,
also Ness Owen and Sian Northey, the editors, will be joining us as well.
mm.
And we definitely invite you to join us for that. What will be an interesting diversion to back to the homeland for some of us. So, diolch yn fawr, Jerry.
So,
And if somebody has further questions or wants to get in
yeah,
contact with you,
you can email.
um,
Easy to find me, Bangor University, Jerry Hunter. You can find me there and email me at work. So yeah, please do get in touch. And thanks for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Bob.
all right, diolch yn fawr.
Well.